7 years in the making, Mount Stromlo's new laser aims to rid our orbit of space junk. Northrop Grumman achieves another milestone in its endeavour to service active satellites. And Spaceflight Milestones, 60 years since Yuri Gagarin and 40 years since the Space Shuttle first flew. It's the 15th week of 2021.
On Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. With the latest science and space news, this is Talkin Science with Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller.
Welcome to Talkin Science. Matt Miller with you for another instalment of the Science and Space News. Dr. Brad Tucker is here. Brad, happy Tuesday.
How's it going?
Really good, my friend, really good. Well, Easter has passed us, which means the winter weather is creeping in and a cold air mass has moved up from down your way and has the Queenslanders shivering. It was 10 degrees at Trekzone HQ overnight.
Yeah, I think that was our high yesterday, so not bad.
Well, before we get into the show, a quick reminder of the socials. We can find you on Twitter at btucker22. I'm on Twitter at Mirrormat86. And of course, Trekzone exclusively on Twitter. Plus, find our YouTube channel for the latest eps and on your podcasting app of choice. Brad, first up in our headlines, Ingenuity, the first helicopter on Mars, has had its inaugural flight postponed to later in the week.
Yeah, when they were doing their kind of full pre-flight check where they're powering it all the way up and hopefully going from pre-flight to essentially flight mode, there was a timeout error in doing that and it shut it down. They've been diagnosing the problem. They haven't said a lot about what the problem is. It still seems to be that they're still working on it. There was obviously optimism that it wasn't a big problem, and so they scheduled it for a flight later in the week. We'll see if they keep that date. But, this is one of the reasons why they've been doing this testing is to make sure nothing goes wrong during the flight or during the big event.
10 astronauts now inhabit the space station following Expedition 65's arrival on the weekend. And that's not all. More folks are going to be moving in the coming weeks as well. It's a busy time for the space station.
It is. That's right. SpaceX Crew 2 is due to go up in about a week and a half's time. Which would bring the total to 14, which, as long as that's not delayed, it has been delayed a couple times, and the SpaceX Crew 1 doesn't come down, 64 doesn't come down, it means that with 14 people, that would be the record for the most people ever in space at a single time. However, that's never even been in the same spot. That record of 13 happened with the Space Shuttle when it was in service. So definitely would be a cozy record for the space station.
Hopefully they've got enough bunks and enough food and oxygen as well. I'm sure they factored all that in, though.
That's right. I'm sure they factored all it in, but it just goes to show how quickly this is changing from going from only really 3 with the occasional 5 or 6 at a time when they were switching over to now regularly going to be having quite a few. And so not only is it that amount of people, but there would also be 4 different countries represented, with obviously the US and Russia, plus 2 Japanese astronauts and a French astronaut as well.
All right, Brad, well, let's get into our stories of the week. And close to home for you, Mount Stromlo finally has a laser for targeting space junk.
Yeah, this has been an exciting project that's just been chugging around in the background for about 7 years since the Space Environment Research Center started. And the whole goal here was to find a way of accurately finding, tracking, and then deorbiting space junk. Space junk here being really small things, centimeter size objects that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of, all of which pose a danger to operating satellites and at some level need to be dealt with.
Well, the adaptive optics method was designed to remove the haziness caused by turbulence in the atmosphere. I'm guessing that was for Earth-based observations, but it's teaming up with the GuideStar laser to track down the space debris.
Yeah, this whole adaptive optics system really has been a way of improving our astronomy images, right? That turbulence in the sky, the reason stars twinkle, is the same reason your airplanes shake. Now, that limits how clear our pictures are in space, as viewed from the Earth, but then it also limits how accurately we can determine and find and correct for objects in space, and again, things like space junk. And so this technology allows us to essentially create a fake star. So you have this giant orange fake laser star, and you see how it wobbles and moves. You can then correct the mirrors and the computer system to accurately, on the scale of less than a millisecond, tell what the atmosphere is doing to give you a better pointing and a better tracking with the telescope. And then that second laser comes along and pinpoints the location of the debris, and then, if determined so, will deorbit it with a second burst.
Well, it's a complex system of measurements and calculations to come up with clearer pictures of the debris. But more than that, it can also shoot at the space junk, as you just alluded to.
That's right. So it's one thing to figure out where these things are, and that's a big job as well, because most of these are uncategorized. Currently, U.S. Air Force radar can track things about 15 centimeters or bigger. All of these small things we just have no clue of. But as he said, we want to also get rid of it. And so another laser comes along and actually deorbits it. So we don't zap it, so to speak, because that actually would just disintegrate it and create smaller bits, all of which are just as dangerous. What you do is you use the laser to push the junk, push it towards the Earth's atmosphere. You'll never be able to push it away. You push it towards the atmosphere to essentially nosedive it into the Earth's atmosphere, and then the Earth's atmosphere safely and almost instantaneously burns it up.
Well, I'm guessing this setup is down the hall and around the corner from you. Do you get to play with it, Brad?
They don't let me at all near it. I stood in the hallway making the sounds, but that was apparently not helpful, according to some. But no, this is a project that has been part of what we've been doing and testing. And again, this technology is using for other projects I am involved with, and that is building, the next generation telescopes that we're building from the ground. This technology can also be used potentially in even things like laser optical communications, communicating via satellites and transferring information using lasers and not radio data.
Well, let's stick with the clearing up the orbit theme. And Northrop Grumman have achieved a new milestone in their aim of extending the service life of satellites with a mid-orbit refueling. We've heard of mid-flight refueling. This is taking it to the next extreme.
Yeah, in fact, I think like 3 extremes in terms of how high they're going. But that's exactly right. This is essentially the equivalent of in-flight refueling. The difference here, well, I guess a similar difference is if it runs out of fuel, the piece dies. Now, they don't let that happen to airplanes, obviously, but in a satellite, once it's done, there is no other lifetime for it. It turns into another piece of space junk. We were talking about last week, in fact, this other satellite that's trying to clean up these old satellites. This is really, as you're seeing, such a big body of work, and there's different ways of not just approaching the problem, but there has to be different ways of approaching problem. And the simplest that Northrop Grumman has identified, among others, is that you just stop it from turning into junk, and that is you refuel it or you fix it. In this case, refueling to extend its lifetime, which saves you money, and it saves that junk problem.
Well, launched in August, MEV-2 achieved some pretty remarkable things, matching the orbit of Intelsat's 18-year-old satellite, approached it, docked with it, and will now hang around for 5 years as essentially a spare fuel tank.
That's exactly right. And the trick here is when they demonstrated this technology last year on their first version, it was with a defunct satellite. So they had a little bit more liberty in what they can do. They were really just trying to move it into a safe orbit out of the way. So if they were a bit rough around the edges, that was fine, so to speak. In this case, this satellite is still working, operating, and they didn't and couldn't interfere in its operation. So it had to work seamlessly and flawlessly, and to essentially attaching, as he said, this spare fuel tank to this satellite. And again, that was the big achievement that they did it. So it really is a remarkable piece of technology, and one that is, very promising for them and other companies looking at doing these things.
Well, it's not done there. After the 5 years are up with this Intelsat satellite, it's going to continue on to another target. That mission is undefined at this stage, but just proving that it's not just a one-time thing. MEV can keep going and do lots of things up in orbit.
That's exactly right. They know eventually there will be other satellites that are needed. And I think this is the beauty of it. If it can keep hopping around, and you don't need a lot of fuel to extend the lifetimes of these missions. That's why it's actually relatively cheap. You're essentially saying for building one relatively cheap satellite, MEV-2 in this case, you're extending multiple satellites, some of which will cost billions of dollars, all for relatively small, cheap amounts of fuel. It's essentially a no-brainer in terms of the cost-saving exercise, just as people have roadside assistance here on Earth.
Well, Brad, lastly this week, it's a commemorative week. 60 years since Yuri Gagarin and 40 years since the Space Shuttle first flew.
Yeah, look, it's I think it's a very big week. There are two very major milestones that happened essentially, well, 20 years apart on the same day. But big anniversaries, especially as we've been talking a lot about the future of space, more astronauts going into space, private space travel, all the stories we've been covering. It started with Yuri Gagarin, and I think that's the point. It all starts with Yuri Gagarin and what he accomplished in 1961.
It absolutely does. Well, that was rooted in the Cold War and the desire for domination overhead. But Yuri's flight served as the gateway for all the years that have followed, as you've talked about there. Apollo to the moon, Gemini, Space Shuttle, Crew Dragon, Space Station, missions to Mars, Artemis. It's all, as you say, it started with Yuri and the Soviet Union back in those very early days.
It really is, and especially if you think about where you went, and only not quite 4 years before, about 3.5 years in '57, Sputnik was first launched. So you go from just getting something up there to putting people up there. That is a remarkable, relatively quick jump that maybe isn't as appreciated, especially if you look at how progress happens nowadays. That is a big step. And they really didn't know what was going to happen. There was a lot of risk in this mission of, when they sent animals into space, a lot of the animals did not fare well, both on the American and the Russian side. There was a lot of risk of Yuri, and he faced it quite well. And it was something that everyone, Americans included, waited and bated breath because of what it would actually mean. If something went catastrophically wrong, not because of the technology the Russians built, but because humans can't survive space, that was a very big question at that time, then that would essentially ended it all. Imagine if they had some sort of result like that and it ended space instantaneously, and it was that person's life being sacrificed for that. And because of his success, though, as he said, we are now where we are today.
Well, in all, he flew aboard Vostok 1 for 108 minutes, lifting off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome and returning to Kazakhstan. An incredible achievement, as well as what we've been talking about, especially given that's only 60 years before that, the Wright brothers had lifted only a few feet off the ground in Kitty Hawk.
Yeah, that's a pretty big jump from, hey, we got something off the ground that is essentially the equivalent of jumping and gliding to, look, I mean, obviously the Wright brothers moment was very big, but that's what we're looking at now. That was a very big, but ultimately small step on forward. In 60 years down the time, further, you look back and we're like, oh yeah, well, of course he went into space. We're now wherever we are going in 60 years from now. But these risks are insurmountable at the time because you can't look it up. You can't look at the information. You can't ask someone for help. It doesn't exist. It just says the Wright brothers had to invent it and test it and risk it. So did Yuri Gagarin. And look, as he said, it was only 108 minutes, but it's like the 108 minutes being stuck in a Volkswagen Beetle back seat. It wasn't very comfortable, right? These aren't the space shuttle that they had lots of room and sleeping quarters. It was cramped, and a reason he was also selected was because he was 5'2" and could fit in the thing. That was one of the selection criteria.
Well, the Space Shuttle was another milestone. It was always incredible to see that vehicle take flight and return. Sadly, not without loss through its career, but 1981 was the first flight of the shuttle, and in particular, Columbia.
It was. And if you think about it, again, 20 years from, hey, now we got humans in space to we have a reusable plane that can go multiple times. That is a very big jump. And this is, it was also the downfall almost of the space shuttle, that it was reliable. It was relatively safe. As you said, there was 2 disasters, but it still was viewed as a reliable, dependable, effective space vehicle, which meant that they didn't look at further development because it worked. But eventually, it took its toll. It aged. Not only did with the Columbia and Challenger disasters, but eventually just the fatigue and equipment realized that they had to go a new direction, which that choice is now why we have things like SpaceX, Crew Dragon, and Artemis.
Well, the shuttle program never really lived up to its goals, but it did provide some fascinating opportunities, as you say, and it did some pretty amazing stuff despite all of its flaws and all of its drawbacks.
Yeah, it's easy to sit here and point out all the flaws, but it was the first of its kind, right? It's easy to say, oh well, this could go wrong. It's always easy the day after look at all the mistakes when you're in the middle of it and you're again the first one doing it. It's really hard. It's the design of the space shuttle that meant we still have the Hubble Space Telescope today, with the Hubble's launch from the space shuttle and 4 service missions that's keeping it going, which is, still transforming in science. All the other things it did for astronomy, defense, a lot of defense applications, human biology, human space flight. All of these things are quite important because the space shuttle existed. And it opened it up to more people and a variety of people, countries going into space than probably would have been normally possible had you just stuck to the 3-seaters like Apollo or Soyuz.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, Brad, before we go, a quick plug for this week's Talkin' Science interview. A couple of astronomers beamed in for a chat about their team's work on identifying 2I Borisov that we spoke about last week, I think it was. It turns out their 2 papers being released at the same time was a coincidence, and they don't agree on the makeup of the comet. Take a listen.
Well, first, you said that the 2 papers don't agree. Well, actually, the 2 papers are completely independent. We were not even aware of the other research until they were published. And they use completely different technique. The polarization paper is polarization indivisible, while the other paper is mostly using radio waves in the submillimeter. So they're really looking at completely different aspects. So yeah, there are some details that are different, but I would say that the important point is that both agree that Borisov is a comet, but that is a different comet. It's not like our standard comet that we see every day.
Well, that interview will be out on Thursday at 12:30 GMT or in the card at the top of this video on YouTube and, of course, on our website, Trekzone.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Trekzone. Catch Brad on Twitter too, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment about any of the stories this week. Brad, another big week of Talkin' Science. As always, it's great to pick apart the stories of the week with you. We'll do it again next week.
Thanks.
Keep up to date with Twitter. Catch new podcasts daily on YouTube. Plus, we're beaming to your favorite podcast app 5 days a week. Just search for Trekzone and subscribe.